All right, so now let's jump back into the final version of the scene. Now, as you can see in the final version of the pirate ship cabin, I'm using volumetric effects for a lot of the lighting. So these candles, for example, these lanterns, and even this skylight, this hatch at the top, are all casting volumetric light, right? So I'm going to jump over into the unlit version of my scene and show you how to set this up. So I'm going to go into unlit mode. Now, as you can see, there's no lighting in the scene whatsoever. And then I want to place a exponential height fog actor. So if I search for fog over here on the left, bring in the exponential height fog actor, go back into lit mode, you can see that it's already added some fog into my scene, right? So what I want to do is, with the exponential height fog actor selected, I want to check this volumetric fog checkbox under the volumetric tab. As you can see, the overall fog has kind of disappeared because I don't have any volumetric lights in the scene. And once I go in and add a volumetric light into the scene, it'll start injecting into this fog volume. So I want to go back over here, and I'm going to go into lights, and I'm going to grab a spotlight. I'm going to throw this in the scene here, drag it up a little bit. I'm going to modify its color to kind of match what I have going on here with this lantern. So a slightly desaturated yellowish orange color, something like that. I'm going to bring its inner cone angle out a little bit. And then I'm going to bump up its volumetric scattering intensity. So the volumetric scattering intensity is actually what gives this light volume, right? So I can scrub it all the way up to 4, and you'll start to see it show up here. Even with a value of 1, it'll show up. It just depends on what your exposure is set to. Now you can only manually, you can only scrub it up to 4, but you can manually type in values. So I can type in higher values if I want to, so 50 for example. And one thing to keep in mind is that color will affect that volumetric lighting. Your inner and outer cone angle will affect it. Your attenuation radius will affect it as well. And pretty much all of the values of the light will affect its volumetric lighting. Now, if I rotate it over this way, you can see that it's casting a shadow, but if you go behind this object, it's not actually, the shadow's not occluding the volumetric fog, which it would in real life, or the volumetric lighting, which it would in real life. So in order to have it do this, you can check this little box down here for cast volumetric shadow. And now, as you can see, the volumetric lighting effect is actually occluded by the shadow being cast by this object. And it does the same regardless of how small or large the object is. So I'm going back up here. I'm going to set this light to movable. I'm going to set all of its rotation values to 0. And I'm just going to direct it straight down, so I'm going to do minus 90. And I'm going to set its outer cone angle all the way up to 80. Its inner cone angle I'll set to 65. Go back into unlit mode for a second, just to make it a little easier. And I'm going to put this inside of my lantern. Now, obviously, I could just parent it to the lantern, which I did in the full scene, and then just zero out its coordinates because it'll be based on the parent's position. But for now, I'm just going to manually put it into position. So now if I go back into lit mode, you can see that it's casting this volumetric lighting effect, the shadow and everything, and it's actually occluding the volumetric effect based on the frames of this lantern. If I go inside, you can see why I actually put back faces in here specifically to occlude the volumetric lighting effect. And then to make it a little more realistic, I can bring down the attenuation radius a little bit. And then also bring down its overall volumetric intensity. So I'm going to set it to, let's say 5. Let's say 2. 3, somewhere around there. Right? And now, depending on your exposure, you're going to see that effect a little bit more realistically. Right, so that looks good, and let's say I wanted to go in and amplify this volumetric lighting effect. I can do that through a particle system using a special material, which I'll show you how to set up right now. So the first thing we want to do is create a new material. So I already have one created here, but I'm going to recreate it for you for the purposes of the workshop. So I'm going to right-click, Material, and I'm just going to call this Volume Master 2. Now, it's always best practice to have a master material and instances based off of that rather than having multiple materials whenever possible. So the first thing that you want to change is you want to select your root node of your material. You go over into the material details, and then you want to change your material domain to volume. You want to change your blend mode to additive. And then that's all you need to change. And now if you go back into your material and you start adding in nodes, I'll show you the node tree that you can use to create the setup for volumetric particle system. So the first thing you want to do is create a one vector here. Convert this to a parameter. This is going to be called intensity. And give it a default value of 1 just so you have something to look at when you first apply the material. Then you want to plug the albedo into that. Next thing you want to do is create a multiply. Create another multiply up here. And then you want to create a texture sampler, so if you can hold T and then you can click. And to create the multiplies, you just hold M and then click, or if you right click, you can search for any of these nodes that I'm placing down. Next thing you want to create is a panner node. You're going to plug the UVs of the texture sampler into that panner. Then you can create another multiply. Then you want to create a text coordinate. The A value of your multiply here will go into that. The coordinate from your panner will go into this multiply. And then we want to make a duplicate of this intensity. And I'm going to call this one mask scale. And let's put all these nodes into a group real quick. I'm going to call this group main. And then let's convert this texture sampler to a parameter as well. Call this one texture mask, and then throw it into another group called textures. Right? So then I want to go in and tie the B pin from my multiply into this mask. And then I want to create a 3 vector, holding 3 and then clicking. Right click, I want to turn this into a parameter as well. This is going to be called my mask speed. This will also go into the main group. And then speed from my panner is going to go into this. This will allow me to control the speed in X, Y, and Z. So RG and B from a 3 vector will automatically turn into X, Y, and Z in world space when you're using it with a panner. So I'm going to plug the B of my multiply into this mask material. I'm going to plug the A into this multiply. Now from this multiply, I want to create a sphere mask. The A input is going to go into that. And then I want to duplicate this intensity one more time. I'm going to call this one extinction. I'm going to give it a default value of 0.07 for this use case. And then I'm going to have 3 nodes coming off of this sphere mask. The first one is going to be absolute world position. So if I type in world position, this is going to go into my A pin. And then I want to get my particle position. It's going to go into my B pin. And then I want to get my radius. So this is going to be particle radius. So anything that says particle before it is actually going to be modifiable through your particle system editor. So I'm going to plug the radius into this. And then I'm going to plug all of this, which is this multiply, into this extinction. Now you'll notice right now it's saying that I don't have a texture, so I'm just going to grab a blank texture here. Doesn't matter what texture uses a blank. I usually use a 32 by 32 pure white texture, just as a placeholder. And then I can go and swap all these out, obviously, in the instance. Right? So this is going to be the setup for our material. So now I'm going to save that. And I'm going to go back to this material in the content browser. Now, since I already have this material created and an instance created off of it, I'm not going to do it for this version, but just know that once you create it, you can right-click, create material instance, name it whatever you want, and then this can be your material. So now I'm going to use the instance that's already based off of the material that I created, which is the same one I just showed you. So if I go under my instances, volumetric, you can see that I have a fog volume for the hatch. It's a different effect for the light coming through the hatch, and then I have one for the lanterns, which I'm also using for the candles. So this is the one that I want to use. So I'm going to go into my particle system. So you can use this, you can apply it to any particle system. I'm not going to go in depth on how to set up a particle system, but you can just apply this material to the particle system and use it. However your particle system is set up is obviously going to control how your volumetric lighting looks. So in order to create a particle system, you just right click and create particle system. So I've already created one, and I have two of them. One's for the hatch and one's for the lanterns, once again, because I'm using different material for each. So I'm going to open up the lanterns particle system. And I can be able to see anything in here because it's not actually going to render unless a volumetric light hits it. So what I'm doing is under required, I'm setting the material to the material instance that I just created, and then I have a second material set up over here, or a second particle system set up over here. It's using the same material, but it's got different particle settings. And once again, the particle settings are going to be based on how you want to set them up for your scene. You can use them for anything from low-lying fog in a forest to mist, to intensifying light shafts in certain areas. It just depends on how you want your particle system set up. So I've got all this set up in my particle system. I've got my material instance assigned to it. And I'm going to drag this into my scene. Now, as you can see immediately, it's intensifying the volumetric effect from this volumetric light. And it's actually got some animation to it and all that. And as I move it around, it's obviously based on how much the particles overlap the volumetric lighting setup. And if I load up the instance for this, you can see that all those settings have been modified, right? So I modified my extinction level. Basically just controls how much it actually affects the volume, the overall intensity. The mask scale, so this is basically just tiling for this texture that I used. And you can use any texture that you want. It could be a black and white texture. You don't even have to use a texture if you don't want to. It's just going to show up as spheres because we're using that sphere mask. Right. And then I can also modify the mask speed, right? So in X, Y, and Z, I can go in and give it a value. Now, the reason it's still moving, even though it's set to 0, is because the particles themselves are moving as well. So you can pan the mask over the particles and have the particles move. You can have the particles just be stationary and then just have the mask move, however you want to combine those features. And then obviously for the full version of this environment, I scaled everything down quite a bit for this particle system. So I set it to something like 0.25, and then it was just much closer and modified the extinction scale and all that. And then as you can see, you get a pretty cool effect. All right, so that's going to be it for volumetric lighting. So the next thing I want to jump into is setting up a particle light.